HOA Karen threatened elderly man over his bird feeder, got chased by angry geese. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was an idyllic morning in the lakeside community where Harold had lived for nearly 2 decades. The neighborhood was known for its beautiful garden homes and well-kept lawns, each house adorned with colorful flower beds, neatly trimmed hedges, and, in Harold's case, a modest bird feeder that he had hung from an oak tree in his front yard. Harold, a retired man in his early 70s, had always been a lover of nature, and after years of hard work, he found peace in the quiet of the mornings, watching the birds flock to the feeder while sipping his coffee. The soft chirps and flutters of the birds had become a daily ritual for him, a small joy in the otherwise peaceful monotony of retirement. But, as with many peaceful moments, things rarely stayed that way for long. The serenity of the morning was soon interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up in front of Harold's house. He squinted out the window to see Karen, one of the more outspoken and opinionated members of the HOA, stepping out of her car with a scowl etched on her face. Karen had never been particularly friendly, and her constant complaints about the neighborhood's appearance had earned her a reputation as a busybody. She was always quick to point out things she didn't like, whether it was a slightly overgrown shrub or a decorative gnome that didn't fit the HOA standards. Today, however, she had come for something a little more unusual. Harold didn't need to guess what was coming. Karen was walking straight toward his front door, her stiff posture and arms crossed indicating she had something important to say. With a sigh, Harold stood up from his rocking chair and opened the door before she could knock. He had known this day would come. "Good morning, Harold," Karen said, though the words came out in a clipped, disapproving tone. "I need to talk to you about that bird feeder of yours." Harold raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What about it, Karen?" he asked, though he already had an inkling of where this conversation was going. "You're attracting pests," she replied sharply, as if the answer was obvious. "Birds are one thing, but now you've got squirrels and even raccoons showing up. And don't get me started on the geese. The whole thing is an eyesore, and it's making our neighborhood look like a zoo." Harold blinked, trying to process her words. "Karen, I'm not sure I follow. It's just a bird feeder. It doesn't harm anyone, and it brings a little life to the place. The birds love it, and it makes me happy. Plus, it's not like it's causing any real problems." Karen didn't budge. Her lips twisted into a tight frown as she crossed her arms even more tightly against her chest. "Well, it's attracting pests, Harold. It's ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and it needs to go. I'm going to file a complaint with the HOA, and you'll be hearing from them soon. Either you take that thing down, or they will make you." Harold couldn't help but feel a slight pang of frustration. He had lived here for years without causing any issues. He'd never once heard a complaint about his garden or his modest decorations, and the bird feeder was hardly a nuisance. "Karen, I don't think you have the right to tell me what I can and can't have in my own yard. The HOA hasn't said anything about this, and frankly, I don't see why it's any of your business. The birds are just doing what birds do." Karen, however, wasn't interested in hearing Harold's perspective. "You'll see," she said, her voice sharp. "Once the HOA gets involved, you'll be forced to remove it. The community deserves better than this." She turned her back on Harold, clearly preparing to walk away and leave the conversation as abruptly as it had started. But just as she began to walk down his driveway, something unexpected happened. The peace and quiet that had once filled the morning air were shattered by the loud, honking calls of a flock of geese. Out of nowhere, a group of at least a dozen geese appeared at the edge of Harold's yard, waddling their way over to the bird feeder with purpose. They had been hanging around more frequently, taking advantage of the seeds that had fallen from the feeder. Harold had grown used to their presence, though they could be a bit noisy, and he hadn't thought much of it. But as the geese began to move toward the feeder, Karen froze, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh no," she muttered, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and dread. The geese, who had been content to peck at the ground, suddenly raised their heads in unison, honking loudly as they advanced toward Karen. She instinctively took a step back, but the birds weren't about to back down. The lead goose, larger and more confident than the others, took a few more steps forward, its neck extended in a menacing fashion. Karen, panic creeping into her voice, started to retreat down the driveway. "Get away! Shoo! Go back," she yelled, waving her arms frantically in an attempt to ward off the geese. But the geese didn't care about her frantic commands. They were too focused on the seed and, more importantly, the intruder in their territory. Harold, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with a mix of amusement and disbelief, couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. Karen had come to lecture him about his bird feeder, and now, the very creatures she had complained about were turning the tables and chasing her down the driveway. The scene was almost comical in its absurdity. As Karen stumbled backward, the geese continued to follow her, honking louder and flapping their wings as if they were orchestrating an attack. She tripped over her own feet in her haste to escape, falling onto the grass with an undignified thud. The geese, now emboldened by their victory, seemed to circle her, honking triumphantly. It was as though they were taking revenge for the insult of her earlier words. "Help! Someone, help!" Karen screamed, but her calls only seemed to fuel the geese's determination. She scrambled to her feet, but not before another goose gave chase, flapping its wings and honking aggressively. She finally managed to make it back to her car, her face red with embarrassment and her pride shattered. As Karen slammed the door of her car shut and sped away, Harold couldn't help but laugh. The absurdity of it all was Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic, being chased off by the very animals she had accused him of attracting, was almost too much to handle. He shook his head, still chuckling as he walked over to the bird feeder, which had remained untouched through the whole spectacle. "Well, Karen," he said to himself with a smile, "looks like you might need to rethink your stance on the whole pest issue." As the geese returned to their peaceful pecking at the ground, Harold took a moment to appreciate the calm once more. He hadn't expected such a dramatic conclusion to his conversation with Karen, but he couldn't deny that it had been a satisfying one. The geese had made their point in the most unexpected way, and now, with a few well-timed honks, the situation had been flipped entirely on its head. The rest of the day was uneventful, and when the HOA's letter finally arrived, Harold took it with a grain of salt. He was no longer worried about Karen's complaints or the HOA's potential response. The geese had spoken for him. In the end, he knew that the birds, the animals, and his love for nature would always be a part of his life, and no amount of complaints would change that. As for Karen, Harold couldn't help but smile to himself. Sometimes, nature had a way of teaching people lessons in the most unexpected and hilarious ways. The following week was filled with an unusual mix of anticipation and uncertainty for Harold. While the geese's impromptu defense of his bird feeder had been a source of humor for him and a moment of unexpected relief, he knew that the real battle was still ahead. Karen had made it clear that she was not one to back down easily, and the HOA, with its rigid standards and penchant for enforcing conformity, was bound to take action sooner or later. Harold had spent decades in this peaceful lakeside neighborhood, carefully tending to his garden, enjoying the quiet rhythm of retirement, and trying to live in harmony with the world around him. But now, his small act of kindness towards the local wildlife had turned into a battleground of sorts. The thought of Karen being able to dictate how he lived in his own home, simply because of a bird feeder, was enough to stir his resolve. Still, he didn't know what would come next, nor how far Karen was willing to go to get her way. He had received a call from the HOA office earlier in the week, informing him that a formal complaint had been filed about the bird feeder, and that a meeting would be scheduled to discuss the matter. The letter arrived a day later, reiterating the HOA's concerns about pests and the overall appearance of the neighborhood, a phrase Harold had come to loathe. He had hoped that Karen's little outburst, followed by her dramatic retreat from the geese, would have been enough to make her realize the absurdity of her complaint. However, it was clear from the HOA's letter that she was relentless. As the meeting approached, Harold found himself replaying the events over and over in his mind. He knew that this wasn't just about the bird feeder. This was about a woman who had taken it upon herself to dictate the terms of everyone's lives in the neighborhood. She didn't care about the birds, the squirrels, or the peaceful moments he cherished so much. To her, the appearance of the neighborhood was all that mattered, even if it meant stepping on the rights of others in the process. The morning of the HOA meeting, Harold dressed carefully. He had spent hours considering what he would say, how he would defend something as seemingly trivial as a bird feeder. His neighbors would likely side with Karen, especially the ones who shared her obsession with maintaining the perfect appearance of the neighborhood. He was well aware that many of them had criticized him for his simple, unassuming life, especially his love for nature. They had called his garden too wild in the past and suggested that his yard looked untidy compared to others. The bird feeder had only added fuel to their fire, as if something so small could bring the entire neighborhood down into disarray. The irony was not lost on him. After all, the birds had been part of the neighborhood long before any of these rules had been established, and he had never once seen a bird cause any harm to the community. The HOA meeting room was filled with the usual faces. Some were longtime residents who had spent years trying to make sure everything remained pristine, while others were newcomers, quietly observing the drama unfold. Karen sat at the far end of the table, her posture as rigid as ever. Her smug smile made Harold want to walk out of the room, but he held his ground. This was his moment. He wasn't going to let Karen win this time, not after everything she had put him through. As he made his way to the front of the room, he could feel all eyes on him. The board members, mostly older and well-dressed, looked at him with varying degrees of disapproval, as if they already knew how they would vote. He wasn't part of their elite circle. His house, though well-kept, wasn't the picture-perfect model they wanted the neighborhood to reflect. His love for the birds, his refusal to conform to their standards, had made him a target. The HOA president, a man named Mr. Larson, cleared his throat as he gestured for Harold to begin. "Harold, we're here today to discuss your bird feeder," he began, his voice cool and neutral. "Several complaints have been filed, and we want to address the concerns raised. As you know, the HOA has certain standards for the appearance of the community, and we've been made aware of the issues that your bird feeder has caused, particularly in attracting pests." Harold nodded, trying to stay calm, but his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He took a deep breath before responding. "Thank you, Mr. Larson. I'd like to start by saying that I understand the HOA's role in maintaining the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I really do. But this bird feeder has never caused any problems. The birds that come to it are part of the natural life of this place, just like the trees, the flowers, and the lake. I've never seen them cause any harm to anyone's property, and I don't think having a few birds visit my yard should be considered a nuisance." Karen interrupted, her voice sharp and insistent. "But it's not just about the birds, Harold," she said. "It's about the pests they attract. The squirrels, the raccoons, and, yes, even the geese. They're a nuisance, and they're ruining the neighborhood. They're making it look like a wildlife reserve, not a place where families should live." Harold took a step forward, not wanting to let her words go unchallenged. "Karen, I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never had an issue with the animals in the neighborhood. They're part of what makes this place special. We've all enjoyed the beauty of the lake and the wildlife that comes with it. I'm not asking for the whole neighborhood to start putting up bird feeders. This is something personal, something that brings joy to my life and to my wife's. And while you may see it as a pest problem, I see it as a small way of contributing to the environment, of allowing nature to thrive." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms tightly, her frustration evident. "You're missing the point," she snapped. "This isn't just about nature. It's about the way it affects the rest of us. People shouldn't have to put up with the mess these animals cause. The geese, in particular, are a major problem. They're loud, they're aggressive, and they're ruining the look of the neighborhood. It's not about joy, it's about maintaining some standard of living." Harold paused, feeling a deep sense of exhaustion settling in. He had been through this conversation in his mind 100 times, but it always came down to the same thing: Karen didn't care about nature. She didn't care about the birds, or about the simple pleasures that life had to offer. She cared about control. She cared about forcing everyone to live according to her vision of what was acceptable, and anyone who didn't fit into that vision was a problem to be eliminated. He sighed, looking around the room at the board members. I don't want to argue about animals or appearances. This bird feeder represents something more important to me, the ability to live peacefully, without judgment, and to appreciate the small things in life. I know it's not about the birds for you, Karen. It's about control. It's about imposing your will on everyone else. Karen sat silently, her expression unreadable, while the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harold could see that they were divided. Some of them looked like they might be swayed by his argument, while others seemed too entrenched in Karen's view of what the neighborhood should look like. Mr. Larson finally spoke, his voice quieter now, as if weighing the gravity of the situation. "We understand your position, Harold," he said slowly, looking at the other board members. "However, we have to consider the overall impact on the neighborhood. We don't want to make a decision hastily. Let's take a vote on this matter and see how the community feels." The room fell silent again as the board members began to deliberate, each one casting their vote. Harold could feel the weight of their decision hanging in the air, and as he waited, he reminded himself that no matter what happened, he had stood up for what was right. The outcome of this meeting was important, but it wasn't the end of the story. Even if the board decided in Karen's favor, Harold knew he would continue to fight for what mattered most: his family, his love for nature, and the simple joys that made life worth living. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Larson cleared his throat again. "The vote has been decided," he said, his tone neutral. "The HOA has decided that Harold will be allowed to keep the bird feeder, provided that he takes steps to ensure it does not attract pests or pose a risk to the property value of the neighborhood." A wave of relief washed over Harold, but he knew this wasn't the end. It was a small victory, but one that mattered. For now, the birds would remain, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had won. As the days passed following the HOA meeting, Harold found himself with a renewed sense of peace, though it was a peace tinged with wariness. The decision to allow him to keep the bird feeder, albeit with stipulations, had felt like a victory, but it wasn't one without a cost. While Karen had been defeated in her bid to control this simple enjoyment of nature, Harold knew she wouldn't let the issue slide. He had spent years in this neighborhood, and he knew that some people, especially Karen, weren't the type to back down easily. The momentary satisfaction of winning the battle over the bird feeder was likely to be fleeting, but for now, he allowed himself to bask in the small triumph. The geese had their place in the yard again, as did the birds, and every morning he could sit by his window, cup of coffee in hand, watching the world come to life around him. But as the days turned into weeks, the storm that Harold had anticipated seemed to be brewing just under the surface. The neighborhood, for the most part, had gone back to its usual rhythm. The gardens continued to bloom, the lawns were trimmed, and the occasional dog walker would make his or her rounds. Still, there was a quiet tension in the air. The neighbors who had previously voiced their support for Harold's right to maintain his garden and bird feeder remained strangely silent. No one stopped by to ask how things were going, and the polite nods in the street were often accompanied by tight-lipped smiles. Karen's influence, it seemed, still lingered, and it wasn't long before Harold found himself feeling the effects of it more keenly than he had imagined. One morning, as he was tending to his flowers, Harold noticed a couple of the younger families in the neighborhood walking by with averted eyes, their children whispering to each other as they passed. It was a strange thing, and while it wasn't outright hostility, it was clear that his position in the community had shifted in ways that made him uncomfortable. No one had come to visit, no one had offered a word of support in the aftermath of the HOA decision, and Harold found himself wondering whether the temporary victory over the bird feeder had actually come with a hidden cost. Had his love for nature, his simple pleasure of watching birds feed, made him a pariah among the neighbors? Had the perception of his home, his yard, and his life been forever altered by Karen's campaign to demonize him? Harold wasn't the type to dwell on things, but the loneliness that began to seep into his daily life was something he couldn't ignore. The once warm, familiar conversations at the mailbox were now few and far between. The exchange of pleasantries felt forced. The HOA had agreed to allow him to keep the bird feeder, but the unspoken tension that lingered suggested that Karen's defeat had only shifted the battlefield to a quieter, more insidious front. It wasn't the bird feeder anymore, it was something more fundamental. It was about the control she had tried to assert over his life, the way she had painted him as the villain for doing something so harmless and beautiful. Karen had made sure that the ripple effect of her actions would last longer than the simple matter of a feeder. She had worked her way into the very fabric of the neighborhood, and now, even if she had lost the battle, it seemed like everyone was left feeling just a little bit uncomfortable around Harold. It wasn't until the following month that Harold's suspicions about the long-term effects of Karen's interference were confirmed. It started small, with the occasional whisper in passing, or a neighbor steering their children away when they came too close to his yard. But then, one Saturday morning, as Harold was sitting on his front porch, reading the paper, a letter was slipped under his door. At first, he thought it was just one of the usual flyers about neighborhood events or upcoming HOA meetings. But when he unfolded it, he was taken aback by what he read. The letter was from the HOA, signed by Mr. Larson, the president, and it referenced the ongoing concern about his bird feeder. The HOA board had unanimously decided to impose a fine for what they deemed reckless maintenance of animal-attracting devices. The letter was carefully worded to sound official, but it was clear that it had been issued under pressure, likely influenced by Karen and her followers in the neighborhood. The fine wasn't large, but it was a clear message. They were coming after him again, not for the feeder itself, but for his refusal to conform to their vision of a perfect neighborhood. Harold stood there for a moment, the weight of the letter in his hands, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The community had always been a peaceful one, but the undercurrents of judgment and conformity had become far more prominent since the bird feeder had come into play. He could almost hear Karen's voice in his head, her disdain for his lifestyle, her need to control. It wasn't just about the feeder anymore, it was about the community deciding that Harold didn't fit their ideal of what a neighbor should be. He wasn't a part of the clique that Karen had cultivated. His independence, his appreciation for the simple things in life, his refusal to conform to a set of arbitrary standards, they were all being held against him now. But Harold, being the resilient person he was, wasn't going to take this lying down. He sat down at his kitchen table, his fingers tapping the letter with a quiet fury as he thought about his options. He could pay the fine and let it go, let Karen have her victory, but that wasn't in him. His pride wouldn't allow it. More than that, he knew that this wasn't just a battle for him, it was a fight for anyone who didn't fit into the narrow box that Karen and the HOA wanted to put everyone in. It was about standing up for the right to live life on his own terms, even if that meant dealing with a little bit of conflict. Over the next few days, Harold worked quickly to prepare for the upcoming HOA meeting, where he would present his case once again. This time, he wasn't just going to argue about the bird feeder. He was going to challenge the very idea of the HOA's power to dictate how people lived their lives. He had been patient, but this latest letter had crossed a line, and he wasn't about to back down. He contacted a lawyer, just in case the situation escalated further. It wasn't something he'd ever thought he'd need to do, but the HOA's consistent targeting of him had left him no choice. He wasn't just protecting a bird feeder anymore, he was protecting his right to live in peace, to enjoy his retirement, and to care for the small pieces of nature that brought him joy. The day of the meeting arrived, and Harold stood before the board once again, this time with more than just his argument. He had the legal advice, the documents, and the resolve to challenge the HOA on its practices. Karen sat at the back, watching him with narrowed eyes, but Harold felt more certain of his position than he had in the past. This wasn't just about the bird feeder, it was about reclaiming control of his own life and showing the HOA that they couldn't dictate his happiness. As he spoke, his words carried weight, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt their personal freedoms threatened by the forces of conformity. He wasn't going to let Karen win. He wasn't going to let the HOA take away his peace. This time, Harold was going to stand firm, and no matter the outcome, he knew he had already won something far more important than just a fight over a feeder. He had won his dignity back. The HOA meeting was tense, more so than Harold had anticipated. He walked into the conference room with his lawyer, a calm but firm presence beside him, and immediately felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. The board members sat at a long table, their faces a mixture of indifference and mild curiosity, but Harold knew they were all watching closely. Karen sat at the back of the room, her arms crossed, her lips tightly pressed together as she gave him a cold stare. There was no mistaking her satisfaction in his discomfort, but Harold was done letting her control the narrative. The bird feeder had become something much more than a simple piece of garden decoration. It had become a symbol of his autonomy, a small but important stand against the rigid standards that had been imposed on him and others like him. The meeting began with formalities. The HOA president, Mr. Larson, cleared his throat and asked everyone to remain quiet as the issue at hand was brought to the table. "Thank you for coming, Harold. We are here to review the ongoing concern regarding the bird feeder on your property," he began, his voice impersonal and businesslike. Harold nodded, his hand steady as he held onto the papers he had prepared. "The HOA has decided to move forward with the fine and discuss the next steps regarding this issue. Karen has raised valid concerns regarding the potential impact on the neighborhood's aesthetic and wildlife management, and we must take these into consideration." At this point, Harold's lawyer, a young woman named Emma, stood up. She had reviewed the HOA's documents and bylaws thoroughly and had a clear understanding of what they could and could not do in terms of enforcement. She had been both a buffer and a guide for Harold through this entire process, and it was clear that she had come prepared. "Mr. Larson, I would like to address the legality of this fine. Under the HOA's own guidelines, there is no provision for penalizing a homeowner for maintaining a bird feeder. There are no specific aesthetic standards in place that require removal of such a personal item unless it poses a direct threat to safety or public health. The issues raised about wildlife are not only subjective but are also not substantial enough to warrant such a fine. Furthermore, the precedent set by the HOA in allowing personal gardens and outdoor decor suggests that the feeder, as a non-invasive feature, falls within acceptable community practices." The board members shifted uneasily, clearly caught off guard by the directness of Emma's argument. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Emma's piercing gaze stopped her in her tracks. "Karen," Emma said, her tone measured but firm, "if you could please refrain from interrupting, we'll get through this faster. You'll have the opportunity to speak once we've heard all of Harold's points." Karen's face flushed with indignation, but she stayed quiet, clearly simmering in the back of the room. Harold, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift slightly. He wasn't facing this fight alone, and with Emma's help, it felt as if he actually had a chance to be heard. The argument continued, with Emma outlining the unfairness of imposing a fine for something as innocuous as a bird feeder. She highlighted how similar complaints about other features in the neighborhood, things like flower beds, decorative statues, and personal yard art, had never been considered grounds for fines or penalties, and how this case was different only in the eyes of one person, Karen, who had made it her mission to push her narrow view of what was acceptable onto everyone else. When Emma finished, it was time for Karen to speak, and Harold's stomach twisted as he watched her rise from her seat. She took a moment to compose herself, standing tall with an air of authority as she addressed the board. "I don't care what Harold's lawyer says," Karen began, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "The problem isn't about the birds or the feeder itself. It's about the bigger picture. This neighborhood is a community, and we've worked hard to maintain its standards. We've done everything we can to ensure that our homes are kept up and that the aesthetic remains pristine. A bird feeder, which attracts all sorts of wildlife, is not just an eyesore, it's a problem. It's a problem for the residents who value cleanliness and order, and it's a problem for anyone who doesn't want their home to look like a wildlife sanctuary." Her words were met with murmurs from some of the other board members, who seemed to nod in agreement, their faces drawn and pensive. Harold could feel his blood start to boil, but he kept his composure. He had learned long ago not to let people like Karen manipulate him into responding emotionally. He knew that this wasn't just a disagreement about a bird feeder, it was a fight for the right to live in a way that made him happy, to live without being micromanaged by someone who seemed to have no understanding of personal freedom or respect. Emma took a step forward as Karen finished, her voice calm and measured but carrying an undeniable authority. "It's clear that the concerns raised are not based on any legal or tangible foundation," she said. There's no question that Harold's actions, in this case, have been completely within the bounds of the HOA's bylaws, and any claims to the contrary are based on personal dislike, not community standards. To impose a fine or make him remove something that doesn't harm anyone or anything is a violation of his rights. And frankly, it sets a dangerous precedent for the future of this community, one where personal preferences can outweigh the well-being of others. The room went silent as the board members exchanged uncertain glances. They clearly hadn't anticipated this kind of pushback, and it was evident that the tide of the meeting was beginning to shift. Harold could feel the energy in the room change. It wasn't just about a bird feeder anymore, it was about a larger issue of fairness and respect for individuality. This wasn't just his fight, it was a fight for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in a space simply because they didn't conform to someone else's standards. After a few minutes of deliberation, Mr. Larson cleared his throat and addressed the room. "I think we've heard enough," he said, his tone still formal but now tinged with hesitation. "The board has had time to consider both sides, and we understand that this is not just about a bird feeder. This is about the overall principles of what makes our community work, and whether personal enjoyment and freedom should be weighed against perceived community standards. We're going to make a decision today." He paused for a long moment, looking down at the papers in front of him. Harold felt his heart race in his chest as the tension in the room grew thick. The decision was coming, and he knew that it would have consequences, no matter which way it went. Finally, Mr. Larson looked up and addressed the room. "After considering everything, the board has come to a decision. Harold, we are rescinding the fine and granting you the right to keep your bird feeder. We believe that nature and personal enjoyment are important aspects of a healthy community, and we do not want to punish anyone for living in a way that does not harm others. However, we do request that you take steps to limit the impact of wildlife on your neighbors, particularly in terms of the geese that have become more frequent in your yard." Harold felt the weight lift from his shoulders as he heard the words. It wasn't a complete victory, there would be rules in place to ensure the geese didn't become too much of a problem, but it was enough. He had won. Not only had the fine been rescinded, but the HOA had essentially agreed that his right to enjoy his property was more important than Karen's desire to impose her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. As he left the meeting, Harold felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in weeks. It wasn't just the relief of winning, it was the realization that, for once, his voice had been heard. Karen had been forced to confront the reality of her narrow-minded thinking, and he knew that this wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for everyone who had ever been made to feel small for simply being themselves. He walked home that afternoon with his head held high, knowing that, for the first time in a long time, the community had shown a little bit of humanity. The birds were back at the feeder, and the geese had returned, honking their victory in their own way. It had been a fight, but in the end, it was worth it.